The president, pictured here, fired more federal workers than all of his predecessors combined, filling the federal government with his own loyalists instead. No, not that president. I'm talking about the other president, the one on the portrait on the wall. That's the seventh president of the United States, Andrew Jackson. In 1829, in his first year in office, Jackson fired 20% of the federal workforce and replaced many high-ranking officials with his own supporters. Jackson was not the first president to put his own people in position of power, but the scale and scope of his moves to surround himself with cronies was absolutely unprecedented. Senator John Holmes of Maine challenged Jackson's decisions. In an 1830 speech to Congress, he called Jackson's actions, quote, "a crisis in our affairs. It is a state of things unparalleled in our history. The public interest is put in jeopardy by displacing experience and fidelity and substituting mere partisans without regard to qualifications," end quote. In an attempt to defend Jackson, New York Senator William Marcy coined the term spoil systems when he declared, quote, "to the victor belongs the spoils." And so it was. The spoil system became the way that government officials were hired. If you were a loyal party member and collected campaign contributions, swung some votes, you could expect a nice, cushy government job at the end of the election cycle. And for much of the 19th century, this was the norm. But the thing about filling the government with your cronies is that the constituents tend to notice. Following a number of high-profile corruption scandals in the 1860s and 1870s, the American people decided that they'd had enough of the spoil system. In fact, Mark Twain, who had never campaigned for a politician before, was so tired of the corruption that he actually went out and stumped for presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes because Hayes promised civil service reform. In an 1876 speech, Twain said, quote, "We will not hire a blacksmith who has never lifted a sledge. We will not hire a school teacher who does not know the alphabet. But when you come to our civil service, we serenely fill great numbers of our minor public offices with ignoramuses." Again, So many politicians benefited from the spoil system, and in fact, it was actually very difficult to reform it because of those beneficiaries. James A. Garfield, who was elected president in 1880, tried to make the change, but it took a tragedy to actually prompt real reform. In July of 1881, a man named Charles Guiteau snuck up behind President Garfield and fatally shot him. Guiteau had volunteered for Garfield's 1880 campaign. He'd written some pamphlets and donated some money, and after Garfield won, Guiteau, perhaps overestimating his contributions to the campaign, assumed that he would be in line for a plum diplomatic post. And when the Garfield administration rejected that request, Guiteau resorted to violence. Chester A. Arthur, who was Garfield's vice president, then assumed the presidency after Garfield's assassination. Arthur had been a staunch supporter of the spoil system, but even he was so horrified by Garfield's assassination that he changed his tune. In 1883, President Arthur signed the Pendleton Act, which established a professional civil service and required employees to be hired based on competency tests and merit. Initially, the act only covered a small percentage of federal jobs, but over time, its scope grew. Since then, the civil service has been increasingly professionalized, and, as importantly, it has been increasingly insulated from politics. That is, until now. On day one of his second term, Donald Trump signed an executive order removing civil service protections for some federal employees, making it easier for the president and his administration to fire them. Since then, his administration has swept through agency after agency, firing nonpartisan experts. And to be very clear, the spoils are there too. Trump's Commerce Secretary donated more than $9 million to his campaign, and his Secretary of Education donated more than $20 million to his campaign. And all of that is eclipsed by the contributions made by his very special government employee, the one entrusted with gutting the civil service, Elon Musk. Musk spent more than $260 million on Trump's campaign. Joining me now to talk about all of this and to put all of this history into context is Joanne Freeman. She is an award-winning historian and professor of history and American studies at Yale University. Joanne, We have alluded to some of the corruption that came as a result of the spoils system, but can you take us deeper? What happened as a result of the government jobs that were essentially being put up for sale to the highest bidder?
Well, the rise of Andrew Jackson meant the rise, essentially, of what now we recognize as a political party. It was organized, there was party discipline, and not surprisingly, with that kind of party came cronyism, corruption, so that Jackson sweeps in and says he's going to eliminate all these employees, and he puts in relatives and friends and newspaper editors and a variety of other people who like Andrew Jackson into these offices. So it was pretty rampant, and his intention was pretty clear. Alexander Hamilton's son, James, who is the second oldest after poor Philip, who dies in that duel, was someone who was close with Andrew Jackson. And when Jackson made him the attorney for the Southern District of New York, he said, and this is a almost exact statement, but kind of a paraphrase, take the job, make as much money as you can, but you are at my command. And I think that kind of sums it up.
Well, okay. All sounds a little familiar. What can that history do to illuminate the current moment that we're in when, as we're seeing, a number of members of this administration are not just experts, maybe not even experts in the particular fields that they are charged with leading. They're simply big donors to the effort to elect Donald Trump.
Right. Well, if you look at the long history of the civil service, it's kind of always a battle between cronyism and merit. Merit meaning expertise, merit meaning knowledge, merit meaning experience. So you start out with blatant, rampant cronyism, and then, as you just said a few moments ago, in the late 19th and then in 1978 as well, you get reform from people who say this is blatant cronyism, it's corruption. What if we institute things so that the people getting appointed to these jobs actually merit the jobs, actually have experience? And so what we're seeing now, in a sense, is blatant cronyism of a sort, or certainly the setup for it, by firing and eliminating people with expertise. And, you know, it's important to remember the civil service, generally speaking, it's not partisan.
Right.
These are people with expertise who do things like keep drugs safe, keep the air safe.
And they often transcend administration. Like, people will be in the same job in the civil service, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, over the course of changing administrations.
Precisely. And particularly if you're working in the government, having someone who has long-term experience, that's vital. That's something that's really important to have.
So this isn't simply about sort of divesting the government of these jobs. Like, we've seen the massive job cuts. It's actually stripping the government of expertise that will take us into whatever the next era of government is. So what's the cost of that? I mean, we've talked about the loss of merit, the rise of cronyism. This is all while the government talks about eliminating DEI and restoring merit-based hiring in other contexts. But what does the loss of expertise actually mean for how government's going to operate?
Well, I mean, bluntly, it's not going to operate as well. And, you know, things are not going to be as safe because the people with the expertise to keep things safe are being moved away. And, you know, we're seeing an attempt to have more control over the government, but control at the price of safety and at the price of accountability, really. So that's what we're watching the stage be set for right now. It doesn't really bode well for what's to come.
Have we ever seen anything like this? Is this unprecedented, or is the only kind of the precursor we have is Andrew Jackson?
On this scale, no.
No.
Not
like,
on this scale. Like Jackson we have, because, and he did wipe out a huge percentage of people. But as far as seeing something on the scale, and at one time, you know, the chainsaw approach to the government and just eliminating entire departments like this within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, no, this is something new.
All right, lessons from history with Joanne Freeman, who has always been America's teacher. Thank you so much, Joanne.